Imagine two people who start with exactly the same financial life. Emma saves every dollar she earns, watching her bank balance steadily grow. It feels safe, predictable, and responsible. Daniel does the opposite. Instead of holding cash, he uses his money as a down payment on a home, invests in low-cost index funds, and takes on a fixed-rate mortgage. To everyone around him, it looks like he's taking a huge risk. Both believe they're making the smartest financial decision. 30 years later, one of them quietly loses a huge portion of their wealth, while the other builds lasting financial freedom. The reason isn't luck, it's inflation. Most people think inflation is simply higher prices. It isn't. Rising prices are just the result. Inflation is really the gradual loss of your money's purchasing power. Even if your bank balance never changes, what those dollars can actually buy slowly shrinks year after year. To make this comparison fair, Emma and Daniel are the same age, earn the same salary, live in the same city, and both start with $50,000. The only difference is how they use their money. I'm Ned, and today we're looking at the invisible force that quietly determines who builds wealth and who slowly falls behind. Emma follows all the traditional advice. She avoids debt, skips risky investments, and keeps her $50,000 in a savings account, adding a little more every month. Every time she checks her balance, it's higher than before, giving her confidence she's moving in the right direction. Daniel puts his cash to work. He invests in broad market index funds and buys a home with a fixed-rate 30-year mortgage of roughly $2,000 per month. Friends think he's buried in debt. At a dinner party, Emma proudly says she owes nobody a penny. Daniel admits he owes the bank over $300,000 and that his investments could lose 20% in a bad year. On the surface, Emma looks financially responsible, while Daniel appears reckless. But that's because most people judge money by how it feels today, instead of how it performs over decades. Inflation quietly changes the rules. Historically, prices have risen by roughly 3% a year over the long run. For this example, we'll use that conservative figure to see what happens when two people make very different decisions with the exact same starting point. Now assume inflation averages just 2.5% a year. That sounds harmless, but over time it's one of the biggest forces shaping your financial future. Think of it as a hidden cost that quietly reduces the purchasing power of every dollar you own. Take Emma. Her savings account earns around 0.3% interest, while inflation runs at 2.5%. Without spending a penny, she's effectively losing about 2.2% of her buying power every year. The frustrating part is she's doing everything she's been taught to do, saving consistently, avoiding debt, and taking very little risk. Her account balance keeps rising, so it feels like she's getting richer. She's not. This is the difference between nominal value and real value. Nominal is the number you see in your account. Real is what that money can actually buy. Most people celebrate the first while ignoring the second. Now flip the story. The same inflation quietly hurting Emma is helping Daniel. He has a fixed 30-year mortgage of about $2,000 a month. As inflation pushes wages and prices higher, that payment never changes. Every year, it consumes a smaller share of his income, making the debt easier to repay in real terms. By the final years of the loan, that $2,000 payment feels closer to paying less than half that amount in today's purchasing power. Meanwhile, the home he bought is likely rising in value. Inflation is effectively shrinking his debt while helping lift the value of his assets. He didn't create that advantage. He simply positioned himself on the right side of inflation. And that's the lesson most people never learn. Inflation doesn't destroy wealth. It transfers it. Borrowers with fixed-rate debt repay loans using less valuable dollars, while owners of productive assets like stocks, businesses, and real estate often see their wealth rise alongside inflation. The same force that's quietly reducing the value of idle cash is often increasing the value of invested money at exactly the same time. So where does all the purchasing power lost to inflation actually go? A large share benefits the biggest borrower of all, the government. Because government debt is largely fixed in dollar terms, inflation reduces its real value over time. That's why inflation is often called a hidden tax. It quietly transfers wealth from people holding cash to those who borrowed it, without anyone receiving a tax bill. The same principle applies throughout the financial system. When central banks raised interest rates above 5% during the inflation surge of the mid-2020s, many expected savers to finally benefit. But most major banks still paid well under 1% on savings accounts while earning much higher returns by lending that money out. The difference became bank profit. That's not a conspiracy. It's simply how the system works. The people who understand its rules usually benefit from them. Now fast forward 5 years. Emma has done everything right. Her savings account is larger, and she even receives a 3% raise. But inflation that year exceeds 3%, meaning her income has actually lost purchasing power. She has more dollars than ever before, yet they buy less. That's inflation's greatest illusion. It makes you feel wealthier while you're quietly falling behind. Daniel takes the opposite approach. After investing in index funds and buying a home with a fixed-rate mortgage, he does very little. The market experiences ups and downs, but he stays invested. His portfolio recovers, his home appreciates, and his mortgage payment never changes, even as wages and prices rise around him. While Emma works harder to preserve her money, inflation quietly works in Daniel's favor, reducing the real burden of his debt while increasing the value of his assets. By year 10, the difference between their financial futures is no longer subtle. It's impossible to ignore. 10 years later, Emma and Daniel's financial lives look completely different, even though they both started with the same $50,000. Emma kept her money in cash. Her account balance has grown, but after inflation, its purchasing power has fallen to roughly $41,000. She didn't overspend or make bad decisions. She simply held cash while inflation quietly reduced its value. Daniel invested in productive assets instead. In real terms, his wealth has nearly doubled to around $100,000, and the gap is only growing because compounding works in his favor, while inflation compounds against Emma. The difference becomes even clearer in everyday life. After years of saving, Emma finally tries to buy the lake house she's dreamed about. When she started, it cost around $200,000. Now it's closer to $340,000, and the required down payment has outpaced her savings. She didn't fail because she lacked discipline. The finish line simply moved faster than her cash could keep up. Daniel receives the same 3% raise, but his fixed mortgage payment hasn't changed in a decade. As his income rises, more of every paycheck stays in his pocket. What once felt like a crushing debt now feels surprisingly affordable, while his home continues to appreciate. Same salary, same raises, same amount of time, yet inflation quietly strengthens one balance sheet while weakening the other. The hardest part is that Emma doesn't realize she's falling behind. Her savings account has never been larger, and on paper, she's never lost a dollar. Economists call this money illusion, focusing on the number of dollars you own instead of what those dollars can actually buy. We naturally notice the account balance, not the purchasing power disappearing underneath it. If that sounds theoretical, think back to the recent inflation surge, when prices jumped by roughly 9% in a single year. You may not remember the exact figure, but you almost certainly remember how much more expensive everyday life suddenly became. You didn't need an economics degree to notice inflation. You felt it every time you went shopping. Egg prices surged. The same grocery trip suddenly cost $40 or $50 more, and fuel prices became so volatile people drove across town to save a few cents. Surveys showed grocery costs became one of the biggest financial stresses for Americans, especially lower-income families, where nearly two-thirds struggled with rising food prices. Eventually, central banks raised interest rates above 5% to slow inflation. It worked, but many people missed one crucial point. Lower inflation doesn't mean lower prices. It simply means prices are rising more slowly. Once prices climb, they rarely fall back, meaning the higher cost of living becomes permanent while inflation quietly continues eroding purchasing power in the background. History makes this even clearer. In 1970, a new car cost under $4,000, the average home around $24,000, and a postage stamp just 6 cents. Today, those same items cost many times more, not because they've fundamentally changed, but because the dollar has. Money left sitting in cash for decades keeps the same number printed on it while steadily losing what it can actually buy. Then there's shrinkflation. Instead of raising prices outright, companies reduce package sizes. A smaller bag of chips, fewer paper towels, or less cereal in the same sized box. While shrinkflation makes up only a small part of overall inflation, some products, like coffee, effectively became around 30% more expensive per serving. So if you felt like your money doesn't go as far as it used to, you're right. Now fast forward another decade. 20 years after starting with the same $50,000, Emma's savings have fallen to the equivalent of roughly $32,000 in today's purchasing power, despite her balance continuing to grow on paper. Fast forward 30 years. Emma's savings account looks healthy, but inflation has cut the purchasing power of her original $50,000 to roughly $24,000. She didn't lose money because she spent it. She lost it because every dollar gradually became worth less. Daniel's wealth tells the opposite story. By owning appreciating assets and letting compounding work over decades, his portfolio has grown to nearly $380,000. The difference wasn't income, intelligence, or luck. It was simply understanding how money works. Even the mortgage that once made him look reckless became an advantage. 30 years later, he's paying it off with dollars worth far less than those he originally borrowed, making the debt easier to carry every year. But cash isn't the enemy. Emma had something Daniel didn't: stability. During market crashes, her savings never fluctuated. If an emergency struck, she could access cash immediately, while Daniel might have been forced to sell investments at the worst possible time. That's why emergency funds matter. The mistake isn't holding cash. It's treating large amounts of idle cash as a long-term investment. Beyond your emergency reserve, inflation usually works against you. Investments carry risks too. Stocks can fall sharply, real estate comes with maintenance costs and illiquidity, and no asset is guaranteed to outperform. But diversified index funds, fixed-rate mortgages, and inflation-protected government securities have historically given investors some of the best tools for staying ahead of rising prices. In the end, Emma and Daniel had the same salary, the same starting balance, and the same 30 years. Emma protected her dollars. Daniel owned assets that historically grew faster than those dollars lost value. That's the real lesson. The goal isn't simply to save more money, it's to preserve and grow your purchasing power. Inflation is always working in the background, quietly deciding whether your wealth is moving forward or falling behind. So the next time you hear someone say they're wealthier because their bank balance is higher, ask one question: do they actually have more purchasing power or just more dollars?